Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wilkinson, and I'm from the International Civil Society Centre based in Berlin, and I am the moderator for today's session. For the benefit of participants who are blind or have visual impairments, all speakers will begin with a short self-description. So I'll go first. I am a pale woman wearing a blue dress with silver hair, formerly very dark hair. Today's discussion topic is protecting minority groups from digital targeting. Digital Dialogues is a series of panel discussions where we explore civil society's perspectives on the emerging digital world. And in previous panels, we have focused on the unintended consequences different technologies can have on marginalized groups. Today, we will be discussing ways in which digital technologies can have consequences on marginalized groups. We'll be seeing how social media platforms, tech startups, new digital products have actually enabled and are actively used to inflict harm, abuse, and violence on marginalized groups, both online and offline. What happens when digital targeting is used to inflict harm and enables gender-based violence? Increasingly, our online and offline lives are becoming integrated, with all users of mobile phones and the internet leaving behind their digital traces. Targeting becomes easy. In fact, the business models of major tech companies are based on such targeting. Algorithms follow us around, we are sent ads, news, and reels. Certain social groups, such as LGBTQ+ community, women, politically oppressed people and activists are being actively targeted, persecuted and abused online and offline via these digital technologies. The role of civil society organisations is often indispensable to ensure that digital targeting is exposed and fought against. There is a lot that can be done to protect minorities from digital targeting and tech-facilitated violence. And we'll be hearing today from experts doing important research and who are involved in wonderful initiatives. They will share what they are doing now on this issue, and we'll be discussing how we can work towards a future of safer digital spaces to protect minority rights. To help us discuss these issues and more, we are delighted to welcome to the panel today, Nix. Nix is a research associate at Rhodes University. Their work includes exploring transgender, non-binary, and gender-diverse people's experience of violence online and strategies for navigating this violence and creating safe spaces. We're also joined by Rasha, who is the Interim Deputy Director of the LGBTQ+ Rights Programme at Human Rights Watch. Her recent work has focused on state-sponsored digital targeting of LGBTQ+ people around the Middle East and North Africa region and digital platforms responsibility. Unfortunately, our third panelist for today, Matt Mahundi from Amnesty International, is sadly unable to join us today and gives his apologies. We will miss his insights on digital technology, particularly around spyware and facial recognition technologies, and the important work Amnesty is doing to highlight the use of digital online surveillance, which enables violence in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly with what's going on right now in Gaza. But do look out for another digital dialogue panel where we can hopefully bring this issue and topic and discuss it in more detail. However, this means that it gives us more opportunity in today's panel to spend more time with our two panelists and have a chance to get more from our audience questions. To start off today, each panelist will introduce themselves and frame the issue by sharing the current landscape and their key points for around 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll have some discussion and questions. At any point during the presentations, please do feel free to put your questions into the chat. We won't get to all of them, but we will certainly try. Nix, would you please turn on your camera and join me here?
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Nix is joining us from Cape Town. Would you please introduce yourself, share your key points, And don't forget your brief self-description.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I'm Nix McLean. I'm a non-binary South African, queer South African. In terms of description, I have short dark hair. I wear glasses, have several piercings, and if at any point I raise my arms, I am also covered in tattoos because ink is political. So my work, I primarily have focused on online violence. So the ways that originally my work started actually in safe spaces. And as I got into researching transgender, non-binary and gender diverse, I will just use trans going forward, people's experiences online, it became evident that the digital was also being used to enable violence against trans people. And so last year, yes, 2 years ago actually, I started a project called the Left Out Project with a co-researcher, Tholo Chichero. I was based in South Africa at the time, and he was based in Rwanda at the time. And we spoke to trans folks in Botswana, Rwanda, Uganda, and South Africa to understand their experiences of online gender-based violence, primarily because we had started to notice, because we work in feminist spaces, that when people were talking about gender-based violence, they were talking about gender as relating specifically to cisgender women and not to gender diverse people. And then as we continued with the study, it became quite evident that the digital media platforms, digital technology, big tech, also startups, so the smaller companies, that there was something happening there that was not protecting vulnerable groups, not only transgender folks. And as we looked into it more, it's something that many of us sense is, and Rachel's already spoken to, it's the for-profit model that neglects, willfully ignores the most vulnerable. If we have a look at what's happened with X, formerly Twitter, the removing of the ethics teams, the human rights teams, there's a strong, it's quite a strong sense of social media, in particular, in my case, this is the work I do in that space, not doing work for everyone. There are particular interests that benefit, and those interests that benefit, they come to harm others, and this would be the most vulnerable. So our participants, in speaking to them, especially those in Rwanda and Uganda, highlighted, and this might also have to do with the status of LGBTQ plus rights in Rwanda and Uganda versus Botswana and South Africa, where there are protections. And so they highlighted to us that when they reported instances of violence, hate speech, bullying, harassment, stalking, platforms did not take them seriously. They either ignored them, or if they reported, they didn't get any feedback, or they were then targeted and they had their accounts shut down or their posts removed, and not the accounts from the perpetrators. And so we started to ask questions about why this was happening, and looking into that and understanding that technology companies take the stance that they're neutral, they merely provide a service, but they're not necessary, and that they're not there to monitor what happens in these spaces. So there isn't really a sense of social justice or an ethics of care around the users and how the users may be harmed by the technology that they have built, and that these technologies are built from a top-down perspective. So they're given, so people come to use them, but they're not necessarily the people using them, such as the most vulnerable, are not included in a participatory manner in the design or how the technology is shared. But one thing that I'm trying to do more and more, because I am concerned about how much violence I've been exposed to as a researcher, the kind of vicarious trauma has been quite real as a trans person myself. And while I think it is very important work, and I will continue to do that work, I'm also starting to look at strategies of solidarity, resistant technologies, alternative infrastructures such as feminist chat spaces, for instance. And one thing that I really enjoyed from the Left Out project was the share that came through from most countries. Participants had done some form of what we started calling a solidarity strategy, where an example from the South African group, and it's difficult to position them geographically because it's digital, so maybe the Southern African region. It was a WhatsApp group of about 600 humans, and whenever someone posted that they had been targeted, and they didn't feel that they could report, or they had reported and then their report hadn't been taken seriously by Facebook, for instance, what then happened was that an alert was sent through to that closed group on WhatsApp, and then as many members as possible would then go and report that post or that account. And so we were seeing the platforms responding more readily because they're being swamped, another word for it. They were receiving quite a mass reporting, essentially. And so these tactics started to pop up. And so my future work, I will be looking at solidarity strategies and feminist forms of resistance where technology is critiqued. So yeah, I think that's really the space I'm in at the moment. And if I can share with anyone who would like to know more about the project or our findings or the tactics that our participants shared with us, as well as recommendations in terms of digital security, digital safety, ethics of care for civil society, so how we take care of ourselves as a collective, as well as the people that we work with. I'm more than happy to be in conversation with anybody who would love to have that conversation with me. Cool.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nix. You could turn off your camera now. Thank you. I would now like to welcome Rasha to join me on the screen. Rasha is currently in San Francisco, very early morning, so good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do unmute yourself and share your opening comments, and don't forget to begin with a self-description.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you all for having me, and thank you for all the listeners for joining in. As Rachel introduced me, my name is Rasha Yunus. I am wearing an olive green blazer. I have short curly hair and I wear glasses as well. I am from Lebanon, so I have I guess I'm a brunette. I have a darker skin tone. And I'm here to talk to you about my work on the digital targeting of LGBTQ plus people across the Middle East and North Africa region. I will start by sharing a brief testimony from one of 120 individuals that I interviewed for a report that we published, that Human Rights Watch published in February 2023. This is Yazid, a 27-year-old gay man from Egypt, who said, "The police took me to the morality ward and kept me until 4 a.m. in a tiny room with no food or water. They took my phone and belongings. When they came back with a police report, I was surprised to see the guy I met on Grindr is one of the officers. They beat me and cursed me until I signed papers that said I was practicing debauchery and publicly announcing it to fulfill my unnatural sexual desires." In this report, we documented that state actors and private individuals across the Middle East and North Africa region have entrapped LGBT plus people on social media and dating applications, subjected them to online extortion, online harassment and outing, and relied on illegitimately obtained digital photos, chats, and similar information in prosecutions, in violation, of course, of the basic rights to privacy, due process, and other human rights. The report itself and the subsequent campaign, which I will speak about briefly, focus on 5 countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, which are Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia. The premise of the research that we had done is not only the pathways of digital targeting of LGBT plus people, but also the offline consequences that individuals face as a result of being digitally targeted online. We saw that these consequences do not end in the instance of online abuse, but rather reverberate throughout the victims' lives and the survivors' lives in ways that often ruin their lives. We focus specifically on security forces, but we also focus on the digital platform responsibility that to mitigate some of these harms that individuals are facing online. And as my co-panelist Nix was speaking about, digital platforms rarely respond or take action when individuals report these abuses and violations against them. And there are many reasons for this that I will get into briefly. LGBT people that I interviewed reported losing their jobs, being subjected to family violence, including conversion practices, having to change their place of residence and even flee their country, and experiencing severe mental health consequences as a result of being targeted online, including on Facebook and Instagram, as well as dating applications. Human Rights Watch interviewed dozens and over 100 LGBT people who indicated that they had reported being harassed, doxxed, outed, and abused on Facebook and Instagram. But in all these cases, Meta, the parent company for Instagram and Facebook, either did not respond to their complaints or found that the content that they reported did not violate its policies, and so the content remained online. As a follow-up to this reporting, and based on the recommendations in it, including to Meta, we launched the Secure Our Socials campaign, which identifies ongoing issues of concern and aims to engage Meta platforms, particularly Facebook and Instagram, to publish meaningful data on investment in user safety, including regarding content moderation in the Middle East and North Africa region and around the world. The focus on Meta is primarily due to its size and its influence and its use in the region. Meta is the largest social media company in the world. It has a responsibility to safeguard its users against the misuse of its platforms. Facebook and Instagram in particular are significant vehicles for the digital targeting and state actors and private individuals' abuse of LGBT people online and offline in the MENA region. More consistent enforcement and improvement of its policies and practices can make digital targeting more difficult, and by extension, make all users, including LGBT plus people in the Middle East and North Africa region, safer. The Secure Our Socials campaign provides a variety of solutions for Meta to keep LGBT people safe on its platforms and asks Meta to disclose its annual investment in user safety and security, including reasoned justifications explaining how trust and safety investments are proportionate to the risk of harm for each region, language, and dialect in the Middle East and North Africa region. Let me simplify this a little bit. When we are talking about content moderation, we are talking primarily about automated content moderation, where algorithms detect abusive content based on the information and data that they are trained in to determine whether the content is abusive or against Meta's policies and should be removed, or is in line with the policies and is peaceful speech that is not targeting anyone and should remain online. The issue is that these algorithms and this automated moderation is not trained in every dialect of the Arabic language and other languages in the region. cannot detect abusive content that often remains online because it is not seen as abusive by these algorithmic processes. So we're asking primarily for human content moderators who are trained to handle some of this content, or at least be able to oversee the automated content moderation and determine quickly and efficiently whether this content should remain online or be removed. In many cases, we don't know. Meta does not disclose and is not transparent about how many content moderators it has that moderate content originating from the MENA region. It could be 6 moderators, it could be 600, it could be 6,000. We really don't know. And before we know, before we have this data, it is very difficult for us to assess whether Meta is investing enough in user safety, especially for the most vulnerable and marginalized populations across the region, who not only face legal precarity offline, but are targeted online for the purpose of securing and justifying their prosecution under abusive laws that target and criminalize same-sex relations across the region. I will stop there, but I'm happy to share other recommendations and solutions that we have proposed alongside this campaign. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rasha. We will now move on to the second part of our dialogue today and provide an opportunity for the speakers to question each other based on their opening inputs. So I invite you both to turn back on your cameras and to ask each other questions to tease out a bit of the relationship and the intersections between your current work.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, Rasha. It was really lovely to hear you speaking to the work you've been doing, because there were so many instances of resonance for me. You know, yours much broader study, and ours was very specifically looking at these groups in SADC and East Africa. But one of the things, you know, that pinged for me was when you spoke about mental health. That was something that came up immediately for us, as well as the transition from online to offline and then offline to online, that the violence, you know, in the world we live in, the tech determinist kind of space, oh, I'm so slow down my speech, sorry, that what we're seeing is so often we talk about the online and the offline as two different spaces. But what we were finding is that the online was being used to target folks offline. You know, the example, the Grindr, for instance, in South Africa, we see gay men in particular being targeted through Grindr, but in a way to not to necessarily implement state violence, but to hold them for ransom, essentially, and that's something else that has emerged. So yeah, I think I'm just sharing a moment of resonance with your work there. I do have questions for you, but I mean, I'd also like to just be in conversation with you for a bit before asking too much.
Thank you so much, Nix. I'm also, I very much appreciate your regional focus and your honing in on this issue in spaces that do not necessarily, that actually in many places like South Africa affirm LGBT plus rights within the legal landscape. And this is something that people struggle to understand in many spaces, is that the criminalization of same-sex relations or gender diversity or gender variance does not necessarily is not necessarily the only condition that leads to online targeting, but rather, for example, in spaces such as Lebanon, the example that you just gave really resonates, because, you know, entrapment did not happen as much. So hunting down people or security forces pretending to be queer or trans people in order to hunt down and target LGBT plus people with prosecution does not happen, but rather online extortion is a method that is very, very common. And this is because of the legal and economic landscape in the country, where Lebanon was undergoing an economic crisis that is very severe, and the local currency had completely deflated. And you know, queer and trans people are easy targets, especially given the criminalization, but also the social landscape that allows for them to be targeted in this way. So individuals and security forces would basically target on Facebook and Instagram and Grindr queer and trans people and ask them for demand huge sums of money in US dollars in order to not out them online and reveal their private information without their consent, which would effectively ruin their lives entirely. It would cost them their jobs. It would cost them even, family life and being able to remain safe within their neighborhoods. So these methods of targeting signal that it's not only prosecution that is on the other end of the targeting, but it's really just taking advantage of the social, political, and economic vulnerability of these individuals in order to achieve either political aims or personal aims in very exploitative measures. And this is also what digital platforms rarely understand, is that it is not only following local regulations and laws that allows individuals to be safe on these platforms, because in many, many instances, the perpetrators are the regulators and are the government and are the security forces whom digital platforms usually rely on for the protection of populations. It takes really an entire creative approach to be able to design from the margins in many of these instances. And this is a framework that one of my colleagues, Afsana Rigo from Article 19 developed, which is compelling and encouraging platforms to design products and features with the interests and the experiences of those most marginalized in mind, because not only does this allow for profit and business, which digital platforms are very concerned about, to continue safely, but also it makes sure that everyone else is safe on the platforms when you take in mind the lived experiences of those who are most marginalized. And I'm very happy to also get introduced to you and speak to you more about this, especially now, with the Anti-Homosexuality Act being passed in Uganda, and the region, the African continent being completely on fire with this slew of legislation that is being introduced, including promoting homosexuality online as one of the provisions in these abusive laws. It is a really dangerous climate, and it's now more than ever that we need this type of research and advocacy.
Thanks, Rasha. Yeah, I appreciate what you're speaking to us, and there's so many threads that I want to return to. But something before, I really want us to also talk about platforms and that idea around ethics of care, and what would it take for big tech to, other than completely giving up on capitalism, what it would take for them to change their model. But something that you're speaking to in terms of the socio-political, especially in Uganda, some of our participants shared how, and this is a really difficult thing to speak to because LGBTQ plus folks are already quite marginalized. And it was one of those moments when we stumbled across this finding that we were like, we do have to publish this. We are concerned about it, but it should be spoken to. So trans folks in Uganda were being targeted by LGBTQ plus Ugandans as a way to protect themselves. So they were offering up the most vulnerable in order to distract police force, the state from their lives. And so saying, this person, here's their Facebook account, here are images that they've shared of themselves dressed as another gender, and drawing that kind of very violent attention in a way to protect themselves. And that's what this climate is asking people to do, to perpetuate violences. With that in mind, I mean, do you want to maybe bounce off some ideas in terms of what it would take for platforms to shift? I love a feminist approach, participatory platform building, platforms of resistance, looking at ethics of care, but these feel like things that are very difficult to articulate to big tech, for instance? Like, how do you explain to them that, in fact, there are real lives being affected and harmed by their willful negligence, essentially, in the desire to profit, profit over people, profit in a way that sees violence and pain continue.
Exactly. Thank you so much for this. It is something that I've been grappling with since I started interviewing these individuals is what are the solutions? We are stating the problem very clearly, but what are some of the solutions that could really improve the digital experiences of those individuals? And we arrived to some, very practical solutions, such as features and products that digital platforms can integrate within their design and according to the risk appetite of a specific context or region. And that is, for example, in one of the methods of targeting that we documented, security forces, immediately when they suspect or are, as you just said, told that individuals are queer or trans, or are non-conforming, or their gender expression is non-normative, they immediately take their phones. They start by searching their phones and looking for digital quote unquote evidence or information to be used in prosecuting them. And in the cases that I have documented, specifically in Egypt and Jordan and Tunisia, security forces and prosecutors use purely digital information in prosecuting LGBT plus people, not only on the basis of the criminalization of same-sex relations, but also cybercrime legislation that is in much of the region brand new. And the cybercrime legislation prohibits, quote unquote, promoting immorality online. And this is a very vague and broad definition of what is considered immoral and what is not. And in many cases, photos such as, a trans person dressed in the way that they feel comfortable or wearing makeup or, a personal information such as chats between them and their loved ones, even WhatsApp stickers. In some cases, the mere presence of the app on their phone is enough to prosecute them and justify their prosecution. So one of the solutions that we offered digital platforms is create a lockdown feature that is very easy for them to create, that allows individuals to basically self-destruct the app with one button, especially if they are aware or they were summoned for interrogation, or they're aware that security forces are about to grab their phone. They could literally just destroy all the information that is included on Facebook, Instagram, Grindr, any app that could put them at risk, and any digital information on their phones that could put them at risk. And this is one solution that we propose to Meta, for example. The other solution is also alongside this lockdown mode for the entire device. It is remote wiping, and they have instituted this actually in Afghanistan during the Taliban takeover, because LGBT plus people were being targeted during the Taliban takeover. Meta included this feature where trusted individuals could remotely wipe your device while it is in the possession of security forces or it's in the wrong hands. And all we're asking is for this to be applied for any user to be able to use in case they are at risk of digital targeting. The other kind of more structural solutions are, we specifically inquire about the number, the diversity, the regional expertise, political independence, training qualifications, and relevant language proficiency of staff or contractors tasked with moderating content originating from the Middle East and North Africa region, and we request that this information is made public. At this stage, digital platforms do not have any transparency around how many content moderators they have who are trained and specialized and speak the language and are able to detect some of this abusive content. We also urge Meta and other platforms to detail what automated tools are being used in content moderation for each non-English language and dialect, what training data and models are used, and how each model is reviewed and updated over time. So Meta and other digital platforms should publish information regarding precisely when and how automated tools are used to assess content, including details regarding the frequency and impact of human oversight. Without this, as researchers and human rights defenders, we have no ability to assess whether the platforms are investing enough in user safety.
Thank you so much for this wonderful interaction. I would love to hear you two just chat for the rest of the afternoon or the morning for you, Rasha. But I'm really aware that we had lots and lots of questions come through via the registration form before. It's a very engaged audience today beforehand, and I see that there are some questions coming in from the chat. So I'd like to turn now to some questions from our audiences. Some of these questions have already been touched on already in your opening comments and also in your discussion right now. But I would like to turn and ask a bit about government regulation. So we've touched on, and you've mentioned, social media platforms and what their responsibility are. I was wondering, and there was a question came through about how effective do you see efforts of government at regulating for social media platforms, and how can CSOs, how can we in civil society hold governments to account? Rasha, I see you nodding. I'm going to ask that question to you first, and then I'm going to pass it on to Nix. Thank you.
I have a very pessimistic response, so maybe Nix should go first.
I think we're in the same boat. And so I was really glad to see you go first. So perhaps, yeah, I think perhaps if you wouldn't mind speaking to that.
Of course, of course. Yeah, so, you know, in many contexts, we do rely on affirmative governments to regulate some of the platform conduct. And for example, in the European Union, there's a new Digital Services Act that basically requires platforms to exhibit a certain level of transparency, of you know, reporting back to the government on regulation of these platforms, and data regarding a breakdown of the reports that they have received and how they have dealt with them. However, this is assuming also that the European Union is a monolith, which it is not. And in many cases, the DSA itself, despite being an affirmative piece of legislation, could be abused by governments that are against the rights of women and LGBT plus people, such as, for example, right now, Hungary, Poland, so many other contexts across the European Union. But if we apply the same logic and the same mode of regulation to contexts like the Middle East and North Africa region, it simply does not work. Because as we said before, the primary perpetrators are the government. And for us to rely on governments to regulate platforms and then rely on platforms to hold governments accountable does not work, because they are not working on the same side in many instances. So there need to be more creative and civil society kind of centered approaches in how we navigate some of this regulation and some of these risks. Because as Nix was saying, you know, there are civil society and activism is so central to being able to coalesce and report some of the violations that are happening on these platforms and respond immediately in solidarity. And that is something that should be foregrounded, funded, and prioritized in the way that individual individuals and communities respond to the digital threats of today's world.
Yeah, so do you mind if I respond?
I do, but I was wondering if you can respond to that, or I was wondering to try and make it a bit more positive, if you'd, Nix, like to give some thoughts about what you believe would be necessary changes to happen to counter digital targeting. So you could either respond or choose a bit more of a positive focus.
So it would be, yeah, so I what I was going to speak to was that governments are not necessarily going to put protections in place because that's not in their interest. And so what we probably stand a better chance of having is having platforms put measures in place. But I mean, I've done some work in terms of fertility apps, for instance, and how the data there has been used and requested by governments to prosecute women who've sought, well, people with uteruses who have sought abortions. You know, so it would be better to look at it from a platform space or civil society in terms of organizing. Yeah, honestly, my response, I do believe that we should, and I took that stance when Twitter shifted dramatically, that we should stay in spaces and resist in those spaces, but we should also consider building our own infrastructures, if possible, if it is possible for civil society. I work with a group, the Association for Progressive Communications, and so they have got measures in place to support their partners, having their own video, the equivalent of Zoom, for instance, having secure drive, using VPNs. So what I would really urge, I think, civil society in particular and vulnerable groups to be making use of those sort of measures. You know, like for instance, Rise Up is a great secure email provider. I've used them quite a lot. Building your own mechanisms if you have that capacity, or reaching out to groups that do have the tech capacity there. But resistance wherever possible, and as creatively as possible, because I do think that there is so much harm, but there are also spaces and potential for seeking joy in the digital, as long as we ensure that we're as safe as possible. I feel like that's a very wishy-washy response, but it's the dreaming. I mean, my work is moving towards queer digital futures and what it would take to have safe spaces. And every single time I've had this conversation with different research partners and colleagues, it keeps coming down to the fact that it is about individual and collective organizing, and we will not see that from platforms and governments, unfortunately.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see some questions coming in. We had one from Primrose from Restless Development, and they're asking, what is the best way to run a global mobilization campaign for LGBTQI groups without compromising safety of activists, especially in global movements like Pride Month? What models of digital safety have worked? And there are a couple of other questions that came through around sort of safety. Obviously, we don't have time to go into full things around digital safety and online privacy, but maybe either of you or both of you could speak very quickly to some top tips, perhaps, or signposts to other places. Rasha.
Okay. In line with the campaign, with the Secure Our Socials campaign, and I can circulate this in the chat, we published an awareness tips document, a guide on digital safety, on how individuals can mitigate and be aware of the fact that they are being digitally targeted and how they can respond to some of the targeting tactics that they receive. So it is primarily a document that is spreading awareness on what digital targeting looks like. It's not necessarily just in the MENA region. It could apply to anyone, anywhere around the globe. And sharing some of these tips. And it's not just, two-factor authentication or safe passwords or anything like that, because those things are also, measures that, of course, we should all have on our devices, but assume a certain privilege and a certain knowledge and a certain access to information and technology that is not always the case for many marginalized individuals. And I'm thinking of trans people across the region. I'm thinking of sex workers who use digital platforms to be able to work. I'm thinking of, in many contexts, even drag performers are being targeted as a result of their art. And, how to detect digital targeting is something that people struggle to understand. So, for example, if someone shares highly personal information with a user without, being prompted to do so, and then requests highly personal information in return, this is one red flag that this individual is, seeking to disclose the sexual orientation or gender identity of an individual, get their phone number, get their address, get their family's, name, status, place of residence. Another thing that we noticed in the research process was that security forces primarily would immediately ask individuals how much they charge in return for sex. And that was one of the tactics that would entrap people, not only for same-sex relations, but also under quote unquote prostitution laws that govern much of the countries where we did the research, where individuals who would say, for example, I engage in sex work, would immediately be targeted as sex workers as opposed to as LGBT plus people. And the way to respond to these risks is, of course, there are ways to secure your devices, but there are also ways for you to hide and cloak some of the apps, some of the information on your devices, not to share private or personal information with someone you don't know, not to share your phone number, to make sure that you're always in a group if you're going to meet someone in an undisclosed location, especially a private residence, to make sure that you tell, friends, community leaders, other people, activists, that you are, engaging with an individual, because a lot of the time, these things don't happen instantly, but rather the perpetrator gets to know the victim and gets to know who they are before they target them explicitly. And this also could happen in inter-community violence. It's not just a perpetrator from the outside. It's also, as Nix was speaking about, individuals who try to protect themselves by entrapping and disclosing information about others.
Nix, would you like to respond to that question?
I'm sorry, I was looking at the other questions and I got distracted.
Well, you can also choose another question if you like. I do have one question that I would like to pose to you, Nix, and we're getting close to the end, and I feel it's a nice way. So you've talked about working towards future, and as we envisage the future of digital spaces, what are your hopes and aspirations for the protection of minority rights and the eradication of digital targeting? Just a small one.
It's a small question. Big dreaming. In a perfect, no, we do not have a perfect context. I think I would like to definitely see, I come really from the kind of the human space of human-computer interaction, to see collective organizing and collective care, and when building technology. So whether this, if we're looking at startups, for instance, perhaps that's a good space for change. Looking at ways of building technology that are participatory, so they are led by the people who are going to use them, but looking at the most vulnerable, understanding what their needs are, whether it's local data. So for instance, an example from the fertility app project, whether that data just lives on your phone and it belongs to you. Nobody else can geofence you to understand if you've visited a clinic, for instance. So this, it would ask so much though of the current climate that we move away from data as commodity, as something, as resource. So collective organizing, collective building, and also resisting an occupation of these spaces, a pushback. I mean, that is really big dreaming. I recognize that, and I'm trying not to dash my own little dreams right now. But I've really been enjoying some of the reading that I've been doing in terms of futurities and the potential for thinking of the current space we occupy, and that these, some of these projects may be destined to fail, but they move us closer to a point where minority groups and people are protected. So I'm not giving a solid response, but I would like to see collective care and organizing.
Wonderful, thank you. We're coming to a close now, but I know that Rasha, you have lots of specific asks with Secure Our Socials and your campaign, and we will take those answers of those are the first key wins that you would like to see in eradicating digital targeting. We've seen today from both of these panelists that actual harm does happen and violence does occur because of digital targeting and online. Tech companies, even if they are taking a neutral stance, that is still a very specific stance, and that is a very clear choice that they are choosing to not get involved. So it's not so neutral. We've also heard that there are lots of strategies and solutions so that there is hope out there. We've heard a lot from Human Rights Watch around rapid response mechanisms, better content moderation. I heard very loudly not to rely too much on automation, machine learning and other AI technologies, and actually you need to have the human in the mix. I think we can all work together. Civil society organisations do have a very clear role to play to protect minorities and to help in the eradication of digital targeting. We have a couple of minutes left. I wonder whether Rasha and Nix, I can give you 1 minute to give any final thoughts or any pearls of wisdom. I know it's a bit of an ask, but Rasha, I'll give you 1 minute to give any final thoughts.
Final thoughts. I mean, I would just reiterate that this is a collective effort. This is not something that could be top down in any way. It can't be, governments dictating how platforms are regulated without taking into account the lived experiences of individuals who are most affected. And platforms also cannot regulate on the level of the government without including those who are most affected. So really the framework is a creative one, and is that centers the experiences, the insights, and the learned lessons of those who we are talking about, because nothing about us without us is the mantra that we should lead with always. So any solution should ground and center those who are affected by digital targeting from a bottom-up approach.
Thank you. Nix, final thoughts?
I think when it comes to civil society groups, activists as well, operating either like on their own or in smaller groups, I think to give careful consideration to the technology you're using for organizing, to think about unintended consequences of that technology. We saw that with the contact tracing during COVID, how LGBTQ plus humans were more vulnerable because of data breaches, for instance. So thinking very carefully about the technology we use, and then establishing networks. So connecting with groups that are doing doing work around digital safety and security, digital ethics of care, and reaching out, because it may feel daunting, but those groups do that work for a reason, and they have a knowledge base and skill set that they would like to share. And I think it's critical that we build communities of practice around digital security, safety and care for everyone, and to make sure that we are considering our most vulnerable when we're doing that.
Wonderful. On that note, I would like to thank you both so much for your thoughtful and inspiring contributions. I'd also like to thank our international sign interpreters and captioner for their great work. And finally, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today and for your insightful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Our dialogues are always available online afterwards, and we post them on our website. Again, we will drop the link into the chat. Further resources from today's session will be sent to all the participants who attended and who signed up. If you'd like to get in touch with our contributors, you can do this via the team here at the centre and email Ryan. Thank you again to everybody. It's been wonderful talking, and I'm leaving with a little bit of hope and lots of ideas and strategies for solutions. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Take care. Goodbye.